Welcome to the St. Charles City County Library. My name is Elizabeth Nelson, the Classes and Events Coordinator. Thank you very much for joining us on Facebook Live tonight for the third of 3 Money Smart Mondays with KMOX's Charlie Brennan. Money Smart Mondays are part of Money Smart Month. Every April, the library partners with Money Smart St. Louis to bring free, informative financial literacy classes and events to you. We've got a great lineup this year here at the library, something for everyone, kids included. This event is just one of over 75 free Money Smart Month financial education events that are occurring all over the St. Louis metro area. Money Smart Month is a community education initiative sponsored by the St. Louis Regional Financial Empowerment Coalition with in-kind support from United Way of Greater St. Louis. The events are also made possible by funders, including Seifel Bank, Commerce Bank, Midwest Bank Center, and many others. You can find out more at moneysmartstlouis.org. Back to tonight and Money Smart Mondays. Charlie is the host of The Charlie Brennan Show with Amy Markskers and provocateur of Donnybrook on KETC TV, 9 network of public media. He is a St. Louis Radio Hall of Famer and author of several books about St. Louis. Charlie is a great friend of the library who's been with us for several events over the years, most recently for his book, Only in St. Louis. This evening's Money Smart Mondays guest is Ron Lieber. Ron is a New York Times personal finance columnist, specifically the Your Money column, and the author of several books. 2 of these books have been New York Times bestsellers. Ron is a 3-time winner of the Gerald Loeb Award, business journalism's highest honor. He lives in Brooklyn with his wife, New York Times reporter Jodi Kantor, and their 2 daughters. Tonight, Ron is here to discuss his newest release, The Price You Pay for College, an entirely new roadmap for the biggest financial decision your family will ever make. In this book, which is the culmination of 15 years of personal finance reporting for the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, Ron gives an emotionally honest approach to the topic. He asks college presidents questions that families don't know or are afraid to ask, puts the surprisingly small amount of existing data on the topic into context, summarizes the research that does exist about what matters and what doesn't, and pulls the curtain back on how schools set prices. We'd love to ask Ron and Charlie your questions. Please post questions and comments for them in a comment under this post. And now, welcome Ron and Charlie.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, and thanks for joining us, everybody. I'll tell you what, this is a great book that Ron has put together. If you followed him through the years like I have, you know he's the best, and we are really privileged to have Ron Lieber with us, especially Ron, because this topic is so murky. I mean, even people who are educated in business, have difficulty with understanding merit aid and the FAFSA, and trying to get your arms around the cost of college is really a challenge. So thank you. And it doesn't have to be that murky, by the way.
So first of all, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here helping the local library. I wish I got to have provocateur in my title somewhere or in some of my introductions. I need to work on that. No, it doesn't have to be this murky. Look, the fact of the matter is that anyone applying for college today for a kid who's going to go next year could end up paying between $350,000 for 4 years of college for that kid, anywhere between $350,000 and zero. There are very much, still in existence these, full ride scholarships that many people think are actually mythical, and you don't have to be a Division I baseball player. You can actually do it just on the basis of academics. But trying to figure out what it's going to be, trying to predict what's actually going to happen is way harder than it needs to be. And when that all crystallized for me, mostly thanks to a whole bunch of readers who educated me about their own confusion, right? And the fact that I wasn't solving for it effectively in the pages of the New York Times, it was only then that I realized that things had gotten so messy so quickly that I wasn't going to be able to solve it in a couple of newspaper columns.
And thus the book. Well, maybe we could talk about some of the basics, because this month we're looking at pocketbook and wallet issues, and people are sometimes told, I don't hear as much about this as I used to, the 529. That's the IRS vehicle that allows you to put money in after taxes and it grows tax-free. Some people suggest, yeah, you can do that because you do get a nice tax break in Missouri anyway, but that accumulated wealth will count against you when you're trying to get financial aid when your son or daughter is a freshman in college. What do you say about that?
Well, I say it's mostly a myth, but let's take a couple steps back and talk about what we're talking about here, right? So for people who haven't encountered the term before or who have been confused by it, a 529 plan is just a basic savings plan, but it's a special savings plan that exists only for the purpose of higher education. And now you can actually use it for K-12 tuition as well. I recommend using it for college in part because if you start early, you get a couple decades worth of compounding, right? Where the interest grows on the interest grows on the interest. And in these 529 plans, you can invest in stocks and bonds the same way you might in an individual retirement account or a workplace retirement plan, right? So 529s have the tax advantages that you mentioned. You often get a state tax break on the way in. The money grows free of taxes. Then when you take it out, you use it for educational purposes. You don't pay any taxes on the capital gains, those capital gains you've seen in the news recently, right? And so the question then is, well, how much is it going to hurt you for financial aid? The answer is not much. If you qualify for any need-based aid, the way the formula works is that the federal government's going to ask a shade north of 5% from you. So you may be wondering, wait a second. That math doesn't work, right? 5% per year over 4 years, that only takes, 20, 25% of my money. Where's the rest of it go? Well, they don't want to set that percentage much higher because it would disincentivize people from saving. And then the government would need to provide even more aid and more loans. The fact of the matter is that the federal government and the college's expectations of your income is crazy high, right? People are being asked to pay $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 a year at, the Wash U's and the Northwesterns of the world, off of $150,000 or $200,000 a year in income. Now, cry those people a river, right? But after taxes, you're not going to have $50,000 or $60,000 left over to write that tuition check. So you better have been saving, and all of that money beyond the 5% that's taxed by the financial aid officers, all that savings is going to be useful so that you don't have to take on debt. So that's a long answer to the short question, but the short answer to the question is no. The penalty is small, and in the course of spending 8 years lapping America trying to report this book, I did not find a single person who regretted saving money for their kids to go to college. Not one.
Very interesting. And I can only say from my personal experience, when my kids were infants, and this was in the early part of the century, 2000, 2001, I started saving at a 529. Did not regret it because the stock market had done so well those last 18, 19 years. So there's that. Then there's something called merit aid. Now, years ago, I would think, oh yeah, he got a merit scholarship. He's a great violinist, or he can, kick a football or whatever. But that's not what we're talking about today. Fill us in.
Sure. So, you can think about the kinds of scholarships that exist maybe in three buckets. There are those athletic scholarships, right? We're going to leave those aside for now. Whole different thing, right? Then there's the need-based financial aid. That was the financial aid that I qualified for when I went to college. I'm a Midwesterner by birth, went to school on the East Coast at Amherst College, got a fantastic financial aid package. And that was based on what my family earned and what my family had. And we did not have nearly enough to pay that tuition back in 1989 to 1993. So I got need-based financial aid based on our income, based on our assets. That system still exists. But another system is sort of hived off, starting in earnest in the 90s. And that's the Marinade system. Marinade is based on what you've done and a little bit on who you are, right? What kind of leader are you? What have you done with your extracurriculars? What kind of grades do you have in your core courses? And SAT and ACT scores, at least to the extent that they exist. There haven't been as many of them this year because people couldn't take the test, right? So that all started, this Marinade stuff started as a sort of competitive weapon. There was kind of a war of competitiveness really in the state of Ohio. You may wonder, like, do these schools really compete with one another? Well, the beauty of the American system is that there are actually a couple thousand choices, but they're all racing to get enough heads in the beds. And it's only, Northwestern, WashU, Carleton College, UC Boulder, that has way more, people trying to get in there than they actually have space for. The rest of the schools, St. Louis University, Knox College, right? Coe College in Iowa, Cornell College. These places are fighting it out to keep the lights on. And so what did they start doing? Well, a school in Ohio called Ohio Wesleyan had developed a reputation for being a party school. Faculty didn't like it anymore. The alumni felt like things were sort of tarnished. And so they just went out and started buying good students. They were buying up the names of people who've done really well on the PSATs, sending them letters saying, we'll let you apply here for free, no application fee. If you get in, we'll give you $3,000 per year. And a whole bunch of people felt really good about it because they were, getting patted on the head. Parents were getting patted on the head. But once Ohio Wesleyan starts doing that, they're stealing more than their fair share of students from College of Worcester in Ohio, Denison University in Ohio. Next year, once you know it, Denison College of Worcester, they start throwing out Marinade scholarships. And pretty soon the dominoes are falling each and every year up to the present day. And all but maybe 40 or 50 schools, both public and private in the United States of America, offer at least some merit aid. And at many schools farther down the food chain, everybody gets a trophy, right? And you're probably doing it wrong if you're paying full price at those schools. So that's kind of how it evolved.
And then the word gets out that there are some schools, Ron, like Alabama, Birmingham, or Oklahoma, Stillwater, where you can get really nice packages. And I don't know if that's still the case, but that's what I heard years ago when my kids were, in high school. How does one learn about all of those?
Well, yeah, so this is true, right? Different schools have played the game, in different ways, but there are some that have been incredibly aggressive and strategic about, buying their way into more sort of prominence. On the private side, the best example from the last generation is University of Southern California, Tulane University in New Orleans, Northeastern University in Boston. Those were schools that were not very hard to get into, a generation ago when you and I were going to college. And now, they accept a sort of some teen percentage of the people who apply. And they literally bought their way, into prominence by throwing a lot of merit aid at better and better students to try and improve the quality of their student population. So how would you know that was going on, Charlie? Well, there's sort of the word of mouth network. College counselors are sort of hit and miss on this, right? The independent counselors, that some people think are worth paying $5,000 or $10,000 for, they're usually servicing the needs of people who can pay $5,000 or $10,000. And oftentimes, although not always, those clients have the ability to pay full price. They're not looking so hard for a discount. So where do you find this stuff? Well, I found a couple good sources that'll be useful for people. First of all, the Paying for College 101 Facebook group is a gold mine, literally. For all of you who have your doubts about Facebook and, whatever mess you think they've made of our sort of political culture and conversation, Facebook groups are the best thing about Facebook, right? Other than birthdays. You can find a niche group about anything. And this is a group of parents, mostly, some professionals, but parents who are just determined to beat the system. And there's somebody there whose kid goes to nearly, every school in the country that you might be interested in. And they've all been through the ringer, and they know how the financial aid process works, and they know about the merit aid at schools, right? So you go there to get educated. And then every school just about publishes something called a common data set. And if you read that common data set, you just Google, right? St. Louis University common data set. And you'll get this giant PDF, and you just read it straight through. It's chock full of interesting information about the institution. It's what they send to US News when US News publishes their guide. And in there, you'll find a whole bunch of information about merit aid. And you can begin, with some basic addition and subtraction to sort out what that school is offering and to whom.
And I also like that in your book, The Price You Pay for College, you direct us to other resources like Tuition Fit, Admit, Merit More, College Raptor. So there are various ways to get more information for the people who find it all very murky.
Yes, yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I mean, one sure sign that things are just an absolute mess is that there are for-profit operators like those who, see an opportunity to provide information and an education about this process because it is so lacking anywhere else. That's a sure sign of a market that's, sort of inefficient, opaque, and frustrating people more than it probably should.
Now, when it comes to need-based financial aid, you fill out the FAFSA form. And I know people with their MBAs have told you that they find it confusing.
Yeah, the person who runs the whole financial aid and admissions operation at the University of Southern California, that job is now referred to as the Vice President of Enrollment Management, right? For all of you, TWA retirees, in the audience who remember, yield management and the birth of yield management, in the 80s and 90s in the airline industry. It's really a lot like that, right? These people are using, sort of computer and software firepower to, do individual pricing for every applicant. But even somebody in a role that sophisticated, I remember talking to the VP at the University of Southern California. She told me she had come from a bank, right? She was a lender, working with small businesses. So she was used to dealing with, complexity and looking at financial statements. She said the first time she encountered the FAFSA, she could not make heads or tails of it. She was just shocked that, this was the thing that we were asking people to fill out at the beginning of the process, where they were making what I would argue is the biggest financial decision their family would ever make. She was aghast, but there wasn't much she can do about it, right?
And some schools use
I
something
mean, what
called.
could she do about it? It's a federal form. Yeah.
Is there something else called the CCS, Ron?
Yeah, the CSS profile comes from the College Board. So get this, right? There's a couple hundred schools, mostly private, who've decided that FAFSA form isn't good enough, right? They need even more information, particularly about your home and maybe some other assets that you have, questions about your small business. And so, they go peering into all of that. And, it makes a fair amount of sense, right? They only want to give money to the people who really need it and don't have it, squirreled away someplace where, they might be able to take a loan out against it, right? Or liquidate some assets. But, if you are a first generation student, if your parents don't speak English, if you're estranged from a parent, it's just,
Right.
it's a lot to confront. It's a lot.
Do you have any recommendations or words to the wise, tips for people who are filling out the CSS or the FAFSA form?
I mean, I wish I did. I guess, I would say a couple things. First of all, I've got a chapter or two in my book that can help you with that. But the best book that I've ever read on the topic is a book by Kalman Chaney, Chany. He's the author of the Princeton Review Guide to Paying for College. And he's been updating that book for, I don't know, it's probably 15 or 20 years now. He's an absolute ace. And he goes through the FAFSA literally question by question by question, just kind of breaks it down and explains it. The other thing you should do, start really early. The FAFSA becomes available October 1st. It's okay to ask questions. It's okay to express and confess your ignorance. These financial aid officers have seen it all. And in the fall in particular, when they're not too busy yet, it's totally okay to write them questions, to ask them questions, or to set up an appointment and talk to them on the phone. Use them, makes them feel good to be helpful.
And this year there's a change because on the FAFSA form, all that work results in what they call the EFC, your expected family contribution, what you're supposed to pay based on your financial situation. And now that people have gotten used to that, they're taking that term away, Ron.
Yeah. So, this is a long story and it's somewhat complicated, but, for decades now, there have been efforts, movements to try and simplify this FAFSA form. Finally happened. It was a going away present to Senator Lamar Alexander, who had, used to show up at hearings, at subcommittee hearings with an entire FAFSA printed out, and it would just be pages and pages, and he would sort of drag it along the floor. Eventually, he got his way in one of the most recent relief bills, the COVID relief bills. They slipped a bunch of this stuff in, and so the FAFSA is going to have fewer questions. People with lower incomes in general are going to come out ahead on their expected family contribution. Probably the most controversial part of it, at least for people who have a little bit more money, the FAFSA is no longer going to give a break to people who have two kids in college at once. So all the FAFSA does, at least in theory, is sort of parcels out federal financial aid. What the colleges do with that expected family contribution, which is now changing to the personal aid index, just because those great expectations were very fraught, Charlie. People didn't like it. I didn't like it. Good riddance to that term. But this PAI, this personal aid index, what the colleges do with it is up to them. And the sense I have, it's about a year and a half till it goes into effect, but the sense I have is that a lot of these colleges are not going to be able to penalize people who have two kids in college at once, because if they start asking those families for 5 figures more annually per kid, the families aren't going to be able to do it. And there's a lot of families who know that this is happening, who are worried sick right now, right?
Sure.
They've got a kid who's a junior and a kid who's or a kid who's a sophomore, a kid who's about to go, and they don't want to have the rug pulled out from under them. So I think the financial aid officers are going to have to continue to give these families a break.
How do families apply for early decision if they don't know what kind of merit aid or financial aid, need-based financial aid, they're going to receive, Ron?
Yeah, thank you for asking. Early decision is classist. I don't like things that are classist. Here's the deal, right? You apply early decision, you're making a commitment that you're going to go if you get in no matter what. But as we've learned, right, the problem with applying for college generally is that you don't know what the price is going to be until you get in. So what kind of system have we set up here, where we're forcing people to apply without them actually knowing what they would pay? Now, it gets a little more nuanced here, right? Because if we're talking about need-based financial aid, when you're applying for need-based financial aid, you can fill out something called the net price calculator that every school has to maintain somewhere on their website. So you can just, go Google, right? Knox College, Beloit College, net price calculator. You can input your financial data and it'll tell you about what the school would ask you to pay and to borrow if you apply and get in and qualify for need-based aid. But on the merit side, there may not be any predictability baked into the net price calculator at all. Schools don't have to do that. In fact, it's in their interest to keep it a mystery because they don't want to tip their cap to, tip their hand to, competitive institutions, right? So if you need merit aid, not going to qualify for much need-based aid, you're kind of boxed out at early decision unless you want to, sort of cross your fingers and hope you'll be able to afford whatever it is that they offer to you. So, that doesn't seem right to me. So I encourage families to break their early decision commitment if the financial offer isn't good enough. The schools will, in fact, let you out of the commitment. They don't like to talk about it very much, but, they can't go around like penalizing or blackballing, entire towns or entire high schools if people break their commitments because they can't afford it. And they're the ones who are not being transparent in their pricing and asking people to make a commitment. So this is really on them. So I'm glad you asked.
You are the first person I have ever heard who said that. It's kind of obvious because how do you get an early decision and then you find out you can't pay for it? You might have to break it, but I've never heard anyone quite at your level who said, hey, if you got to break it, you got to break it. Now, let's move on. Let's move on to borrowing money. And I know if you're watching, we're going to ask for your questions. You can submit them and Elizabeth's going to have some. We're only scratching the surface on many different chapters. There's much, much more to Ron's new book. But Ron, you really opened my eyes to what Americans are going through right now, because truth be told, they could start saving for their children's college in utero, okay, And then they get a loan when the kids are between 18 and 22, which could last 30 years. And when you add it up, a family can spend 50 years paying for one consumer service, college.
It's crazy, right? I mean, mortgages in this country are 30 years max. Now, people refinance and they end up spending more than 30 years, sometimes paying for, a residential dwelling. But yeah, I mean, this is what it's come to, right? I mean, it's, you can live pretty well around your parts for $500,000 a year, certainly, right? But 2 undergraduate educations at, say, Fordham and UVA out of state full price, that could cost more than $500,000, right?
Oh yeah.
And so there's no it shouldn't be a surprise that it could take half a century to pay for the whole thing. But it's sort of amazing that that's what we've come to, right? And we are singular among nations in asking that, in expecting it, expected family contribution, in expecting our families to contribute, right? As if it's like a charitable donation or something, expecting them to contribute up to that much. It is what it is. And sure, it's not necessary, right? You could send your kid to Mizzou, they'll turn out to be an amazing journalist, right? Lots of other great programs there, other state universities they can attend. You can go to community college first, lots of other ways to keep the cost down. But it is sort of incredible what this has turned into.
Well, I will say, I'm sorry, go ahead, Elizabeth.
Why has it skyrocketed, the cost of college and university, compared to like when my parents were going to school in the 70s?
Sure. So I guess there are a couple reasons, right? I mean, first, let's talk about the state systems. The state systems are not as highly subsidized by the state governments and state legislatures as they used to be. Now, the states would argue maybe that they're not getting the federal money, the federal support that they used to. And it's true that the caps on undergraduate student loans, Pell Grants, that kind of support has not kept up with inflation. So they have a point there. But often when there is a big recession, particularly 2008, 2009, luckily this time state revenues did not fall off a cliff, at least so far. But in 08 and 09, all of these tax revenues just evaporated. And one of the easiest things to do at the state level is just to cut the subsidy to the schools and let the schools figure it out, right? And the universities have to decide whether to butcher their programs or just jack up prices to state residents, and particularly, to people from out of state, which is, where they try and make up some of the difference or get a lot of international students to come. So at state universities, there just isn't as much government money coming anymore. On the private side, it's a little more fuzzy, right? List prices have gone to the moon, but about 90% of people who go to a private college or university get some kind of discount, right? Whether it's the need-based aid we were talking about before or the merit aid. So the net price of those institutions hasn't gone up at quite the same rate, but it's still high. So what's the reason for that? Well, private colleges and universities feel like they need to offer smaller classes, a little more hand-holding, more on the administrative side, better, larger activities facilities. Some of them are undergraduate only, right? It's all they do. And so there's a lot of infrastructure that's necessary. There are more regulations than there used to be. We get the regulations we vote for at the ballot box. I think nobody would argue that, we don't want equal opportunity for athletics for our daughters, same as we do for our sons, or access for disabled students, or mental health services, or better career centers, or a highly functioning technological network at these institutions. But all that costs money. You need a lot of grown-ups and well-trained grown-ups to run all that stuff and provide the infrastructure. And so, sure. I mean, could we provide an undergraduate education, public or private, for $10,000 all in, including room and board, instead of $25 or $65? There would probably be a way to do it, but would we like it? No, we wouldn't like it at all. We wouldn't like it one bit, right?
Maybe so. Can I just add a quick comment here? Back in the day, and I know this is ancient history, but when I went to college, this was Boston College, which was the Jesuit school of Boston, like the slough of Boston. You know, the dorms were cinder block walls. We didn't have a lazy river. We didn't have Adirondack chairs surrounding a fire pit that looked like Beaver Creek. I mean, but it changed in the 1980s and 1990s. It did change. And I think that the schools went upscale to compete with each other, but also explain to our viewers the Shivvus Regal effect. And you know that's true because the president of George Washington admitted it, maybe in your column.
Yeah. All right. So first of all, I'm just going to role play for 30 seconds here. I'm going to pretend that, I'm the, the dean of residential life at St. Olaf College in Minnesota. And what I'm going to say to you, Charlie, I smell upper middle class living on you, right? I smell vacations at places that have had lazy rivers. I smell a gym membership or maybe, a Peloton in the garage, right? Your children want the things to which they have become accustomed. And it is not our fault that they have grown used to living in a certain way. Maybe it's not your fault either, Dad, right? Maybe it's America's fault, right? But if we don't provide those things, if they're not living in the manner to which they've become accustomed, or if they sense that they won't, they might not come here, right? So it's not our fault, right? This is just the market and the way they've been raised by you, right? So we're just following your lead here, right? We're just following your lead.
There may be some truth to that, but I hate lazy rivers, but go ahead. And I hate climbing walls too, but go ahead. But the kids, truth be told, the kids were in a lazy river back in their youth. That's true.
Yes. All right.
But the Shivvus Regal effect, you can't deny that because, well, we'll explain to everybody what that is.
So the Shivvus Regal effect, the legend goes like this, and I actually tried to get Shivvus Regal to confirm or deny that this ever happened, and they wanted nothing to do with me. But here says maybe they just want the legend to persist because it's good for their branding. So the Shivvus Regal effect in higher education, involves a legend where supposedly Shivvus Regal, which is I think not a particularly high quality whiskey as whiskeys go, but nothing particularly wrong with it. Supposedly, many years ago, in a galaxy far, far away, they doubled their prices overnight, unannounced, and right away they tripled their revenues. Right. So the moral of the story is like the more something costs, the more money you make. Right. People actually want to buy more of something that's more expensive, and people found that compelling in the world of higher education because there were schools like, Rice University is a good example, a really well-endowed institution, rich institution. And for years and years, it subsidized its tuition with those endowment earnings so that, the list price was something like, 40% of, the Ivy League or USC or Stanford or whatever. And people just didn't think it was very good. People thought there was something wrong with it, right? They couldn't understand why it was so cheap. And eventually, even though they had like more money than God, they jacked up their prices to look like everybody else's because they were tired of explaining themselves and they were reasonably sure it was costing them in the marketplace, right? So all of these schools that offer Marinade to, nearly everybody, sure, they could reset their tuition, lower it permanently, lower the list price by $10,000 or $15,000 a year. But then would people think less of them? Maybe. Do you want to kind of bet the farm, that's the move that's, going to cause you to get more students and better students? I mean, there are schools that have tried it and, often their applications go up some. But, the ones who tried it 10 or 15 years ago, more often than not, their tuition just sort of creeps right back up again to, where it's on par with their competitors. So the Chivas Regal, stuff, it's habit forming, right? Like many alcoholic beverages.
Well, we do want to take questions from viewers, and I know, Elizabeth, you may have one or two. Elizabeth has 2 master's degrees, which we established at our last session when we were talking to Brad Stinn and Adam Grossman about accumulating money. But Elizabeth, do you still have student loans to your name?
I do. I'll announce that to the world right now.
Well, it's the reality we live in. And I think the real question is, where have we gotten in this country where everyone, especially our young people, Ron, are in debt coming out of college? That just wasn't the case years ago. I know you mentioned that state universities are cutting, or states are cutting back and all that, but it's a real issue because when you look at the ability to save money and accumulate wealth for retirement, the earlier you start that and start that compounding, which you mentioned, the greater chance you're going to have a nice nest egg when you retire. But if you spend your 20s paying off debt, you may not be investing in the nest egg.
Yeah. So, I'm glad you brought that up, right? Because where does all that lead? We don't actually know where it leads, right? The 1.7 trillion with the T dollars in accumulated student loan debt, that's more than tripled in the space of 12, 14 years here. So we are very, very early in this. And let's just be clear about what we've done here. We've conducted one of the biggest and most uncertain economic experiments in American history these last 20 years by starting in with all of this education debt. And we're using teenagers as guinea pigs. Let's just think about what that means, right? I mean, forget about the policy or the possible solutions or what President Biden is or is not going to do or should not do. What we've done is, it's amoral. It's amoral.
Mm-hmm. Well, there are good educational alternatives that cost less. And I do tell our listeners on KMOX, I remind them that until recently, the Fortune 500, list of the largest corporations in the country, if you took the top 20 corporations, 2 of them had CEOs from the University of Missouri, St. Louis, Valero Energy and Express Scripts. Now, Express Scripts is no longer in the Fortune 500. It was bought up by somebody else. But it is, and no other school except Cornell could claim that. 2 of its alums were CEOs of top 20 corporations. Now, maybe that was a fluke, but we have seen in this country a lot of people who have gone to the state schools and they have done extremely well, and they have left the state schools less in debt than their friends who went to private schools.
This is true, right? And I am all for that. But since you evoked, or invoked, right, the supposedly, most prestigious positions in life that one might attain, right? I should just mention that, I went out and checked out a bunch of those, right? So think about it this way. If you go, as I did, and you round up the resume of every senator, every member of Congress, every general manager of every, sports team and every major professional sport, the people collecting money from the fanciest venture capital firms, the people who work at the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, I've worked in both places, among a handful of others, what you'll find is somewhere between 12 and 47% of the people at these institutions are people who, as undergraduates, went to one of the 45 schools that has the highest average SAT score, right? And that, tends to pair with, sort of the most expensive and most selective schools in the country, right? So then the question you have to ask was, well, were all of those people already on this kind of trajectory, before they even got to college? Or is there some special, juice, in the tomato sauce in the dining hall at Northwestern and Wash U and Rice University or whatever? Mm-hmm. And I think the answer to that question is yes, right? Most of those people would probably achieve the same heights, but did rubbing shoulders with other people all on similar trajectories make a difference for them, right? Were they able to strap on to somebody else's rocket, at some point earlier in their career? Did people throw the rope back for them whose trajectories, were equal, in part or mostly because of where they went to school? Yes, right? Now, there's absolutely nothing wrong with you or your kid if they don't want to be a CEO, or if they don't want to get venture capital money from Kleiner Perkins, or if they don't want to work for Goldman Sachs, or if they don't want to be the general manager of the Cardinals. But if they do, this stuff matters a little bit. And so you got to think about it, and you got to think about whether it's worth paying for.
Very interesting. What if you don't get the merit aid or the financial aid you were looking for, but you do want to go to that school? Who should write the letter or make the phone call? The student, the parent, and what should be in that letter? And actually, this might be the time of year for which this question is especially relevant, right?
So in other words, if you haven't gotten as much as you think you deserve, or as much as you think you need, and you want to make an appeal.
Yes.
Okay, so let's say you've applied for need-based financial aid. That comes from the financial aid department. And you want to address the financial aid officer, and hopefully you're coming in with some evidence, some receipts, right? And you can prove that you've had a change in financial circumstances that necessitates one of the financial aid officers to exercise what's known as professional judgment, right? To maneuver around or through whatever rules that they normally use to try and see you as the individual you are, and address your situation uniquely. And you go in very politely and you make your ask. And this is the time of year when a lot of those conversations take place. This is not negotiation. These people do not want to be treated like or feel like used car salespeople, right? No offense to used car salespeople, but they don't want to feel like this is haggling. Okay, so then on the merit aid side, there you go to the admissions office, because that's where the merit aid comes from. And hopefully there you've got another offer in hand from a competitive institution, but maybe you don't want to go to that competitive institution as much, but their net price, their bottom line price is lower, right? Because of merit aid. And then you go to your target institution with great humility and say, you know what, Mrs. Admissions Officer, Mr. Admissions Officer, I think we may have made a mistake here, because we've got another offer in hand where the net price is lower. We thought we filled out the applications the same way, but we're worried that we may have screwed something up here with your school. And so could we have a conversation about the application and, and how you made the decision? And a little secret here, right? The admissions officer probably didn't make the merit aid decision. It was probably a computer algorithm that made the first offer, because it's software that's sucking up all of this data and trying to figure out what people will be able to pay and willing to pay. Okay, so that's the secret, right? So the admissions officer is looking at this merit aid offer for the first time. Admissions officer has some wiggle room. And so you want to go, humility, right? I think we might have made some mistakes. And oh, by the way, while you review this, can we just talk about all of the great things that, son or daughter has done in the last 3 or 4 months since they filled out the application, and how much, they could contribute to your institution and to your campus. And maybe you do that with the kid in the room, maybe do that without the kid. It's a relatively rare 17 or 18-year-old who can sort of lead the charge on that and do it themselves, but it can work, if it's the right kind of letter or it's the right kind of conversation. If the kid goes in solo, it can be very impressive. So it just depends on, what kind of high school senior you're dealing with. But by all means, ask. By all means, ask. The worst that can happen is that they'll say no, and then you're just back where you started.
So you're telling us that a robot figures out the merit aid at least on the first pass?
More often than not, that's true. There are consulting firms, a whole industry of them that sit behind the scenes. They suck up all of this application data, your financial data, grades. They have ranked every high school in the United States using a whole bunch of data about how kids from those schools tend to do at the client schools. Whether the kids persist, right? It's a big deal for these colleges if somebody transfers out or doesn't make it. So they want to know they're going to get that tuition revenue for 4 years, right? Wow. And so there is a robot, an algorithm that, figures all this out and then tries to make a guess as to the most that you would be able and willing to pay, and, not $1 less. And that's the opening offer.
If we could back up just a little bit, Ron, and you pointed this out, and it really was a stark awakening for me. And that is, if a student is depending on good grades to get the merit aid, that student should be apprised of the rules before sophomore year in high school, because then if the freshman year was B's and C's, it might be too late to get that GPA up to a 3.8. So you recommend, hey, sit down with the youngster when he or she's in 8th grade. Now, you've got to do that, but here's the twist. How do you do that without causing too much turmoil and stress and anxiety? I mean, we don't want the kids ending up in college stressed out, and first stop is the mental health counselor. And that's actually, from what I understand, a very popular destination for today's college students. But that's a fine line one walks, isn't it?
It's an extremely fine line. And look, I'm not thrilled to be offering this advice, but there are basically two choices we have, right? We can tell them how the system works before they're sort of enmeshed within it, starting in high school. Or we can, attempt to protect them from all of this and try and keep them from learning about it until they're juniors, right? But if you wait until that point, the vicious math of grade point averages has effectively done them in if they've been, sort of slacking off, right? And once they find out about it, if and when they figure out that you knew the whole deal and you deliberately kept it from them, they're going to be furious, right? What do you mean you didn't think I could handle the truth, right? How could you keep this from me when it was going to impact my future? So what do you say to them in 8th grade? Well, look, I follow my own advice. We did this with our daughter. I think what you say is this. Say, look, we can't avoid the fact that there's going to be a lot of conversation about college, starting very soon. And it is true, that the things that you learn and the foundation that you build, both in terms of your learning and your academic record, is going to matter when you apply for college. So, let's start by reminding you that the amazing thing about the American system is that there are probably hundreds of colleges that you could go to and have an incredible experience. And so we're not worried about where you're going to go, right? We're not worried about that. But you should know, that we're probably only going to be able to pay X, right? Or we would prefer not to pay Y. And there are some institutions, that are more selective and might have more to offer, a student like you, that won't be affordable for us, unless you earn some of this merit aid. And that's going to require you to really apply yourself, starting at the beginning of 9th grade. And if you don't, right, or if you do your best and you don't get straight A's, you don't get straight A minuses, we're not going to be disappointed in you. But we just want you to know, and it's not going to be bad for you either, because there are going to be other institutions that will be happy to have you where you will thrive. But we just want you to know how things work, so that you're not mad at us for not having explained things to you. Because our job, first and foremost, is to explain to you how the world works, and how important systems function. Mm-hmm. And this is an important system, and it'll probably be important to you. And so, that's what we did. Our daughter nodded along, and, she's already pretty motivated. But, what she wanted to know was, she wanted to know right away. She sort of seized in, and she said she wanted to see the list of, the most selective schools in the country, and she wanted to know which ones offered merit aid. So I don't know whether she was starting to scheme that, if she got a lot of merit aid and it was, ended up with a net price that was less than what we had saved, whether she was going to get the money, or I don't know. It's not quite clear where she was going with that. But, she really wanted to get down to brass tacks. But not every kid's like that.
Ron, can an American save money by studying abroad? Not just for junior year, but I mean enrolling in a foreign university.
You can. There's a lot of conversation about this. Not that many people ultimately have the guts to do it. The thing that's complicated about it is, often, although not always, undergraduate institutions outside of the United States want you to choose a course of study right away, and you sort of have to stick with it because you're, literally enrolling in a school that only does one thing, right? And so that's complicated. Many of these institutions, most in fact, do not have the same sort of support infrastructure that American institutions do. So there may not be a counseling center. There may not be much of a career office. There may not even be dormitories, right? You may be moving right into an apartment, and you're gonna have to cook for yourself. You're gonna have to figure out how to, shop in the grocery store, even if you don't speak the language. It's a lot to take on for 18-year-olds, but for the right 18-year-old, one who is sort of self-confident and self-motivated enough, to find a way to navigate, work rules in Europe and how to make sure a resume gets seen in St. Louis if and when they decide they want to come back, 4 years from now, with a name on the resume that nobody's ever heard of or few people have. For students who are up for that challenge, you can get a really good education for not that much more, sometimes a little less than the cost of, going to a zoo. So, and it's an incredible adventure. Living in Amsterdam is probably more exciting than living in Colombia, but maybe not for everybody. Yeah. There's no football games in Amsterdam.
No, there aren't, but that's why they made DirecTV or whatever. One thing I didn't know, you write that a lot of parents feel shame, and I feel terrible to hear that, well, of course, people feel guilty about everything. So why not throw college in there too, or the inability to fund college? But, I will say, I do know a student who got into Boston College and couldn't pay for it, and so went elsewhere. And in fact, I worked with a fella who got into MIT, but he couldn't pay for it. So he went to Lindenwood, which is a fine college in St. Charles. But I never really considered what the parents are thinking. And you point out that some parents, for whatever, they feel shame about this. And I hope you can encourage them not to.
Yeah, I mean, in almost every case, you've done the absolute best that you could with the cards that you were dealt and the circumstances that, you were dealing with. And, even if you do have regrets, even deep ones about, how you spent your money 10 or 15 years ago, just try to give yourself a break and remind yourself that luckily this is not Europe, right? And, your kids are not tracked, to apprentice programs, and their entire lives are not dependent on how they do on some, exam when they're 16 or 17. And there are all sorts of opportunities to go to local or regional, state or private universities, or start in community college, and still have, an absolutely fabulous educational experience where you can find your way to incredible professors who become mentors. There are amazing teachers everywhere, and especially at the smaller colleges and universities where teaching is the primary point of the exercise and not running around collecting federal dollars trying to do research, right? So, you can make the most of, any opportunity that's in front of you with the right amount of, motivation and direction, and have a, an incredibly happy experience and a terrific life. And so, what I worry about is, sort of parents in, middle or upper middle class milieus where, there's a lot of buzz, around college around them, and everybody else seems to have a way to pay for it. And, the problem is that like your neighbor one block over or down the street isn't admitting that they're borrowing $150,000 from the federal government per kid to make it work. They aren't admitting that, they've got a side business as a bookie, right? They're not admitting that there's some grandparent or great uncle somewhere who's just writing the checks, right? And so you may look around and it seems like everybody else is able to sort of make it work, but we don't actually know all that much about anybody else's financial lives. And our own financial lives are our own financial lives. And I don't feel like parents should have to apologize for whatever it is that they can't or can't do. Just about everybody has done the very best that they can.
And you never know when you see the list from the high schools of where the kids are going to college, and they used to be published all the time in local newspapers here. You never know if someone is going to school X because he or she couldn't afford school Y. And you sometimes think, oh, these are the schools that the kid got into. No, those are the schools that the kid got into and the family could afford. But no one ever talks about that. But I will say, two stories for you. And I have a small regional book called Only in St. Louis. And I do point out that there was a fellow by the name of Greg Myrie, grew up in St. Louis. His first 2 years were at community college, and then he transferred to Yale. Today, he's the national security correspondent for NPR. And I have another story for you. Danny Meyer, the founder of Shake Shack and all those great restaurants in New York, when he applied to college, he didn't get into one of them. He was rejected by all of them. So he got on his knees and he begged Trinity in Hartford to accept him. They did. And he's done reasonably well in his life.
Yeah, we're lucky to have him in New York. He's the one that brought toasted ravioli to our menus.
Oh, you're good. You're exactly right.
Can I jump in here with an audience question? We have Meredith here wondering, do you have any advice for graduate school, or how much of what's in your book and what you've discussed tonight applies to graduate school?
Yeah, a lot of it does not. And my research focus was almost entirely on undergraduate education. So I'm afraid I can't help much there.
And then can you speak a little bit more? The focus of your book is definitely parents who are saving and planning for their children. But there was definitely a middle section that talked about the worth, like what you're paying for and the worth of your education, which I felt like a lot of those questions, which Ron has a whole bunch of questions that like he encourages you to just sit down and ask the colleges there, you know, to see what you're going to learn, what you are exactly paying for. And I'm wondering, Ron, what you think about students that are, you know, high school students that know their families can't afford anything. They're on their own, or they're maybe estranged. How much of what your, you know, advice in this book can apply to them? And then do you have any outside advice beyond that for those that are kind of going on their own?
Sure. So I guess the first thing you should do is try and figure out, you know, do you have a target institution, right? Or is there just a school nearby that you find even mildly interesting? Try to make a friend there, you know, in admissions or financial aid. I mean, just show up, you know, in person whenever it is that that's going to be possible. And just tell your story, right? You know, you're 19, you're 21, you're 24, you haven't gone to college. You're flying solo. You're really determined to make it work, but you really need some help. And again, right, you know, the professionals who work at these organizations live to help people like that. And I get that it's hard to ask for help. It was hard for me to ask for help. But, you know, I did that with our financial aid officer, Joe Paul Case. He and I are still buddies. He's retired now. But, you know, every year I went into his office with my mom, and we would sort of, you know, rattle the can essentially. You know, it was like a slightly more advanced and evolved version of that. But, you know, we basically tried to get him to give us some more. And he always did, right? And, you know, we'd have a conversation and you know, we would work it out. And so, you know, if you're on your own, I believe in you, right? But you're going to need help. And you should not feel bashful or ashamed about asking for it, because there are professionals out there who only want to take people like you by the hand and you know, turn you into their very next success story. Now that doesn't mean that they're going to, you know, hand you a blank check, right? You know, there are going to be loans involved, and there's going to be work involved, and it may take you longer than, you know, an 18-year-old who's just getting it paid for by his parents. But it generally helps to bring in an expert at the soonest possible moment who can help you develop a plan, because the stuff is not as simple as it should be. And so it's good to have somebody by your side who knows what they're doing.
Well, Ron, we can't thank you enough for the time you shared. This was fascinating. And I know we're going to post it on YouTube so people can go back and watch it again and again and again. Folks, the book is The Price You Pay for College. And Elizabeth, you know where this book is available, don't you?
I do. The book is available at Main Street Books, our local independent bookstore. Their website is mainstreetbooks.net, so please check that out. And if you'd like to find out more about Ron, check out his website, ronlieber.com. Those two links will be posted momentarily in the comments below. And you will also see a link to a short feedback survey about this Money Smart event tonight. We'd love to know what you think we're doing well and what we should keep doing, and then what we can improve upon. Everyone that completes the survey and includes their email address will be entered into a drawing for a $50 gift card. We'll be giving away 5 gift cards based on a random drawing, and the winners will be notified by May 14th. I hope you've had a wonderful, informative evening. And I'd again like to thank Charlie and Ron for joining us tonight. As Charlie said, this event will be on YouTube for you to rewatch or share with friends. Also, all the Money Smart Mondays are here on Facebook, so you can rewatch them from there. We have a few more Money Smart events this month. April's not quite over, so please go to our new online events calendar at mylibrary.org to check those out. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you. Good evening.
Thanks, y'all.
Thanks, Ron. Thanks, Elizabeth.